Ladies and gentlemen, the show will begin momentarily. Please direct your attention to the stage.
All right, good morning. Welcome. I'm already losing stuff off the podium here. I'm Clinton Griffiths. I will be your MC today. Enjoyed my first big night here in Fargo yesterday. Had a little bit of a hiccup flying in. Of course, flying into Fargo in the winter, not exactly the easiest task to do, but we got here. I grew up in southwest New Mexico, so about 30 miles from the border down in southwest New Mexico. You know, we didn't even have Uber back then. We had Umberto. So if you needed a ride, we could just ask Umberto, and he'd show up. He'd give you a ride anytime we wanted to go. I live in northern Indiana right now, where I'm the host of Ag Day Television and the editor of Farm Journal magazine. Married, 3 kids. My wife usually likes to come on some of these events when we do them in the winter. I don't know. How many of you have a spouse? 2 of you came today? Show of hands in the room. All right, here we go. My wife likes to drive. So whenever we go, she likes to be the one in control. She likes to drive. Once in a while, I'll get to hold the wheel, which is nice. She'll even let me hold the wheel for a while. My folks live out in New Mexico still. They ranch out there near Tucumcari, which is near the panhandle of Texas. And we did a 20-hour drive over Christmas to go out there and see them. Still married. Thank you for your prayers. It was a heck of a drive, but it's nice to get to go back and see your family, get around part of your roots. And I think that's what I really love about agriculture, and that's why I work in this industry, is because it is so family and home-oriented. Anytime we go somewhere, we'll go and we'll do an interview at a farm, and usually it ends with, hey, would you like to come in and have pie? Or would you like to come in and have coffee? And I've found you always say yes. No matter what, you always say yes, because it's the polite thing to do. And so there's just a few things about working in this industry that make it better than working in general news. So I've been doing this for about 20 years. My first job was at Hays, Kansas, working for a CBS news station. And I remember my first foray into not everything that is said is actually what happened. And so I'm in Russell, Kansas. McDonald's was in town doing a listening session with ranchers. How many people remember when McDonald's was having trouble with ranchers because they were buying beef from Australia? This is about a decade ago or more. Maybe 2 decades ago. Thank you for saying yes. So about 2 decades ago. And I go to the meeting. It's very contentious. I mean, farmers are standing up, ranchers are standing up in Kansas. They are yelling at them, we have beef here, why don't you use ours? And of course, they're taking questions. So after the fact, I interview one of the vice presidents of McDonald's, and he has a handler. And so I set up my camera, I'm there by myself, handler's standing right behind me. So I ask the VP, I was like, well, how have you been received around the country when you've gone and done these? And I see the guy behind me go, great, really good. And the guy, without missing a beat, goes, we've been received really well all over the country. Well, that is not what happened. But that was my first experience as a new reporter where I saw, oh, that's how this game works. So it's an interesting industry to work in agriculture and in news media. I've done it for about 2 decades now. I really, really enjoy the challenge of it, although, as our first speaker will probably tell you, the last 10 days have been a little more than a challenge. I wonder how many times you've rewritten your speech in the last 5 hours. Probably more than once. Before we get too far along, of course, I'd like to say thank you and welcome a few people up to the stage to kick us off. Let's bring up the co-chairs for the 2025 Northern Corn and Soybean Expo, Rob Rose from North Dakota Soybean Council and Carson Klosterman with North Dakota Corn Utilization Council. Let's give them a round of applause. Have them come on up.
Good morning and welcome, everyone. I'm Rob Rose. I farm with my wife and my son in Wimbledon, crop rotation, soybeans, corn, wheat, barley, and pinto beans. We are very humbled to continue as the 5th generation on our family centennial farm. I currently serve as Vice Chairman of the North Dakota Soybean Council. We recognize that your time is very valuable and making this trip is no small effort. So first, thank you for coming. Thank you for choosing to spend your day with us. This event is for all of you to bring together ideas, tools, and connections that can make a real difference for your operation.
My name is Carson Klosterman, and I farm with my family in Wyndmere. My wife and I have a partnership, and I farm alongside my father, Tom, where we grow corn, soybeans, and sugar beets. I serve on the North Dakota Corn Utilization Council as the current chairman. Rob and I are honored to welcome you to the 8th Annual Northern Corn and Soybean Expo, and we're excited that you joined us here at the Red River Valley Fairgrounds. The fairgrounds reflects our commitment to the North Dakota agriculture. Our investments like the Ag Education Center highlights its importance, educate the next generation on modern farming. Visit that building today to see those efforts in action. North Dakota corn producers are represented on the North Dakota Corn Utilization Council by a board of 7 members, elected from across the state. And board members work diligently to grow a healthy, profitable business climate for the North Dakota corn industry through the investments of checkoff dollars in both domestic and international market development programs, research, education, policy, and promotion. As chairman, I want to thank you for entrusting us with your checkoff dollars as we work on your behalf to grow resiliency in this corn industry. I would also like to recognize our partners at the North Dakota Corn Growers Association, whose 18 dedicated board members represent farmers across the 7 districts statewide. Both the North Dakota Corn Growers Association and the North Dakota Soybean Growers Association work tirelessly to advocate for your interests in Bismarck and Washington, D.C. Be sure to connect with the board members or visit their booth today to learn more about their work and the benefits of becoming a member. Attend their lunch meeting today to learn about legislative efforts and the value of membership firsthand.
Soybean producers are proudly represented on the North Dakota Soybean Council by a dedicated board of 12 farmer leaders. These farmer elected representatives work tirelessly to direct soybean checkoff investments into programs aimed at increasing farmer profitability, focusing on research, market development, promotion, and education. The North Dakota Soybean Council is proud to collaborate with our sister organization, the North Dakota Soybean Growers Association. The association plays a crucial role in advocating for policies and regulations that directly affect our farms and farming communities. Join me in recognizing the dedicated members of the Soybean Growers Association Board of Directors, as well as the representatives serving on the American Soybean Association. Let's extend our gratitude for their tireless efforts and advocacy on your behalf. Finally, I would want to acknowledge the North Dakota farmers serving on the United Soybean Board. These 3 farmer directors nominated by the Soybean Council and appointed by the U.S. Secretary of Agriculture play a vital role in driving demand and improving profitability for U.S. soybean farmers. USB, like the Soybean Council, works on advancing research, collaborating with the supply chain, and developing markets for soy oil and meal, both domestically and globally, ensuring that farmer investments deliver maximum returns.
We also want to take a moment to acknowledge all of you, our North Dakota farmers. Your resilience, innovation, and hard work are the backbone of our communities and economy. You are why we are here, and we are very proud to represent you. Certified crop advisors can earn CEUs at today's session. Simply scan the QR code that's displayed to register or visit the front registration desk to provide your name and information for credits. Don't miss this opportunity to enhance your professional development. And let's not forget the trade show floor. With cutting-edge technology, innovative solutions, and expert representatives, it's a fantastic place to explore what's next on your operation. Be sure to stop by and talk with exhibitors about how their tools and services can meet your specific needs. Before we dive into today's program, we want to take a moment to thank the many people who make this event possible. A special thank you to the corn and soybean staff, the fair staff, directors, and your dedication makes this expo a success year after year.
We'd also like to remind you that the Northern Corn and Soybean Expo is made possible each year through the valuable investments from your corn and soybean checkoff programs. Events like this expo, along with other checkoff initiatives, drive innovation, open new markets, and enhance agriculture's impact on the economy. Your checkoff contributions are essential in ensuring a resilient and profitable future for North Dakota soybean and corn farmers. Together, we are strengthening an industry that supports your farm, our communities, our customers around the world, and the broader economy. Thank you for trusting us to work on your behalf.
On behalf of the Corn and Soybean Councils, thank you again for being here. We're confident that you'll leave today with new insights, valuable connections, and perhaps fresh ideas to take back to your own farms. Now, please join me in welcoming back to the stage your MC for the day, Clint Griffiths.
Well, thank you so much. Let's give them another round of applause and tell them thank you for, and the staff for helping get this put together. You know, we're lucky. This might actually be my last event. I think my wife may make us a lot of money. She raises chickens. She got about 15 layers at the house, and I'm thinking, you know what? I may be done with this TV gig pretty soon. You know, she's getting hit up in the school drop-off line every day. Hey, you got any more of those eggs? You got any more of those? I could use a dozen, you know. It seems to be pretty lucrative these days. Well, can we go back to a couple of those pictures, guys? I know I skipped over them earlier. If we could pull those up from out in the field. I said I've been doing this for about 20 years. About 15 years ago this month, I was working at Oklahoma State. It was before I began working for Farm Journal, and I was on a trip to Morocco. I didn't know anything about Morocco or Moroccan ag, but we ended up in this ancient city called Volubilis. It's kind of nestled in the Middle Atlas Mountains. There's these Roman ruins, and it's just a really cool city to see how old. I mean, obviously parts of the U.S. we have kind of old historic buildings, but I mean, we're talking, these are BC ruins, right? These go way back. And in the background, you can see behind there that it's a winter wheat field. So this is in February. It's just a winter wheat field for as far as you can see. And we found out that this was at one time the breadbasket for the Roman Empire. This is, and on the hillsides around are olive trees. And so you get the wheat, you get the olive oil, you make bread, right? That's the way it works. And so this was kind of the crux of that civilization. And so we had a translator who was and he's speaking in broken English. And one of the lines he said while I was there really stuck with me. He said, you know, the Romans figured out that without agriculture, there can be no culture. And I thought, you know what? That's probably as profound a statement as I've ever heard about this industry. Without agriculture, there can be no culture. And I think that's so true. And I think we need to remember that as we go through today and we talk about all the things that are happening in the world and all of the work that you do every day, that it's that important. It's that vital to the prosperity of what we're doing and the prosperity of this country and in feeding the world. And so I challenge you with that, to keep that in the back of your mind as you listen to all of our great speakers today and you hear their messages, that you are renewed and that you're able to take that and use that this season, even with all of the things going on, that you're able to take that and use that as motivation for another growing season and another year. We've got a couple of housekeeping things. Let's do that real quick before we get too far along. This right here, this is a passport. If you get it stamped, you will end up, when you're talking to folks at their booths, have them stamp it. We'll put it in a drawing, okay? So you need to be present to win, but it's kind of you can win a prize. And just for talking to folks, you're going to do that anyway. You might as well participate. Also, little tents on all the tables. There's a QR code. You can scan your phone, and then you can go in and ask questions of our speakers. We're going to have the ability to ask all of them questions, and we'll read them right off of here, okay? So if you'll, as you're listening, you have a question pop up, go ahead and type it in. All right, we'll try to have this be interactive as we go throughout the day. And then our certified crop advisors, the guys mentioned it, you can earn those continuing education units, but you need to scan the QR code at the end of the speech, and that will get you closed out for that CEU, okay? All right, let's bring up our first speaker. I'd like to introduce Jacob Shapiro. He's the head of geopolitics and macro research at Bespoke and the partner at Cognitive Investment, focusing on the intersection of geopolitical change and technological innovation. He also hosts the Jacob Shapiro podcast. Jacob lives in New Orleans with his family. Help me in welcoming to the stage Jacob Shapiro.
Good morning. I have been rewriting my presentation pretty much every week at this point. I was giving a presentation last week, and Trump announced the Mexico-Canada tariffs while I was on stage, and I was getting questions about it. So, President Trump, if you're listening, if you could hold off for the next hour, that would be really nice for me. I begin every single presentation I do the exact same way. I am here with the unrighteous and profane task of speaking to you today about politics. All of you have political opinions in this room. I also have political opinions. Not only that, I guarantee you that my political opinions are better than your political opinions. If you'd like to hear about how much more righteous and correct I am than you, I will be here for the rest of the day. As a proper Southern gentleman, bourbon is my poison of choice. I think it takes about 3 to enjoy the conversation about political opinions. But that's not why I'm up here. I'm here to give you an objective sense of what I think is going on in the world today. If I do my job correctly, you will have no idea who I voted for in the last presidential election. Some of the things I say will make you want to light your hair on fire. Good. If you agree with every single thing I say in this presentation, I have not done my job correctly. My job is to try and describe what I think is going on in the world and where I think we're going, and hopefully you can plug that into what you're doing on the farm every day and make it productive. So, I have 3 main goals, and I only have 45 minutes to do it. So I'm going to paint with a broad brush, and we're going to move fairly quickly, because I am committed to making sure we have time for question and answer. First of all, I want to model how the world is working. I want to understand what's going on in the international political system. Second, I want to talk about President Trump and his tariffs and try to explain what the heck I think is going on. And then third, I want to take some silver linings for specifically corn and soybean growers in the room. So let's buckle up our seatbelts and get in. Before we can model what is going on in the world today, I want to define how agriculture has worked for the last 100 years. World War I was a really bad time for not just US farmers, but farmers all over the world. And that was because in the context of World War I, we had all these great technological innovations, and one of them was the advent of modern fertilizers. And modern fertilizers were great. They meant that you could increase yields beyond anybody's wildest imagination, but that drove down the price of a bunch of different agricultural commodities. And things got so bad in the years right after World War I that the US government was literally telling farmers to burn their crops in the field, to try and take some of their commodities off the market. Now insert Herbert Hoover. He's Secretary of Agriculture at the time. He later becomes President of the United States, and he decides he's going to kill 2 birds with 1 stone. He's going to save the US farmer by making sure he can export all of these surplus calories to international markets where they can get a better price and where they can continue to sustain their lives on the farm. And number 2, he sees that Europe is particularly hard up. A lot of their agriculture was destroyed in the war, so he's going to prevent the rise of communism and fascism by making sure the young men and women of Europe are fed at the time. Now, he nailed number 1. Because ever since that moment, US agriculture has been about exporting surplus abroad. He didn't do so well with preventing the rise of communism and fascism. That didn't work out so well. But literally since the 1920s, US ag has been thinking about exporting abroad, to the point where this is what a map looks like today in terms of food self-sufficiency. The darker you are on this map, the more self-sufficient you can be in terms of calories. What I want you to see on this map is there is a lot of light. There is a lot of gray. Those are all countries in the world that cannot produce enough food to feed themselves. Countries that maybe couldn't have culture without agriculture, to reference what we were talking about just a second ago. Between 11 and 28% of the population can feed itself. This is over 4 billion people. And this is globalization in a nutshell. All the countries that are shaded darker here, they export their surplus calories abroad, and the 4 billion people in the countries that are shaded in light import those calories and are able to live and have families and things like that. That, I think, is beginning to change. I think countries are thinking more and more about the self-sufficiency of their food supply chains, and that's because the world is becoming a multipolar geopolitical environment. Now, multipolar is just a fancy, highfalutin, pretentious word to say that there is not one dominant power in the global system today. I don't care how old you are, I don't care how much experience you have, none of us in this room have lived in a multipolar geopolitical era. The last truly multipolar era was the 1890s. If you were alive then, please find me afterwards. I would like to know the secret to longevity and living forever. For the last 30 to 40 years, it has been a unipolar world. We have called the shots. Everybody listened to us no matter what. Everybody wanted to join the WTO. Everybody wanted to be a part of the US trading complex, Iran and North Korea being maybe the outliers. Before that, we had a bipolar world, dominated by the Soviet Union on the one side, the United States on the other. This is a thought experiment of mine. I update it every quarter or so. I'm not going to get everything right here, but when you're thinking about the world, I want you to think of it in terms of different spheres of influence. You can see on this map, I've got the United States in dark blue, I've got China in orange, I've got Europe in that ugly shade of teal. Turkey is in red. That sometimes makes people raise their eyebrows. They're building military bases in every single one of those countries. I cannot decide if India is about to take over the world or completely collapse in on itself, so I just punt and throw it into a group of middle powers. The specifics are not important. It is no longer about make the best product for the cheapest price and somebody will buy it in the global marketplace. Politics is going to dominate this from now on. I have been saying this for over 10 years. Secretary of State Rubio, in an interview just yesterday, used the word multipolar. I haven't heard a US elected official or a US appointed official like that use that word since the Nixon administration. So maybe we're finally getting somewhere in terms of the government realizing that this is what is happening. That can be a little abstract, so let me make it a little more concrete. The last act of the Biden administration on its way out of the White House was to restrict US exports of certain types of semiconductors to different countries in the world. The countries in blue have basically no restrictions, the countries in yellow have some restrictions, and the countries in pink have a lot of restrictions. This is telling you right now that the United States is dividing up the world into those that it wants to have good trade relations with and those that it won't have good trade relations with. For something as meaningless as how countries vote at the United Nations, we are seeing massive differences in how trade is developing. Countries that are voting together at the United Nations over the last 2 years have been trading with each other between 6% and 8% more, whereas countries that have been voting against each other at the United Nations have been trading between 4% and 6% less. And that's a meaningless UN vote thing. Just imagine if we were actually talking about things that were important to countries and not just how they're virtue signaling at the United Nations. Now, I don't want you to think that I'm saying everybody's just going to go home and trade with themselves. That's not what I'm saying at all. This is a great map. It's showing you different trade flows and how they're increasing or decreasing in the world and how that might change out to 2033. What I want you to see is there's actually a lot of green on this map. So even if at the top level, trade between the great Olympian powers, like the United States, China, is decreasing, all these countries on the periphery, like Mexico, Brazil, India, Indonesia, these are all countries that are actually trading more with each other, and that more trade is happening in some of those regional blocks and regional spheres of influence. Trade wars and things like that are best for the countries that are not a part of the trade war, and you're already seeing that happen a little bit in general. Now, let's tie that directly to ag. This map should also look a little bit familiar, but this is showing you what crop yields are like relative to potential in all of the world. The dark red areas or the dark orange areas on this map are places where their yields are not even close to what they could be if they had a modicum of modern seed technology, modern equipment, modern approaches to how agriculture works in general. There's a lot of space out there for these places that have been importing calories from abroad because it was cheaper and easier to increase their own production. A couple examples. A couple years ago, I was giving a presentation and I made fun of Ethiopia because Ethiopia came out and said, we are going to become a wheat exporter in 2 years. And I laughed. I said, that's nonsense. Not only are they not going to be able to do it, they're fighting a civil war amongst themselves. Hundreds of thousands of people died in that civil war. There was no possible way that the Ethiopian government could surge wheat production. It took all of 2 years for them to make me look like an idiot. Because now, not only are they self-sufficient for wheat for themselves, they export to the rest of East Africa. And they're talking about the next staple crops that they want to do it for, not just for their own country, but for exporting in the region. So you look around the world, it's not just about China, it's not just about the United States. All these different countries are seeing what's happening in the world, and they're saying, we want to be a little more self-sufficient. We want to understand how to do things a little bit differently. You might be asking yourself, by the way, how did the Ethiopians pull this off? It was very simple. The Ethiopian government went out and bought seeds and bought tractors and went to the farms and said, use these and use these at this time, and your yields will increase 40 to 50%. That's exactly what happened. To bring that a little closer to home, we have lost our status, or are in the process of losing our status, as the low-cost producer for corn and soybeans. Brazil is going to be the country that ascends to that title going forward. Now, corn, it's a little bit back and forth. We've been playing back and forth with them, but soybeans, this trend is already a little bit long in the tooth. Now, that doesn't mean the end for corn and soybeans, but it means that something fundamental is also changing in your markets as all of these things are changing on the top. And I'll get to what that means sort of by the end. But as you have Brazil as an alternative supplier, that means if a country like China doesn't want to buy US soybeans anymore, they don't have to. There are alternative markets, and Brazil looks like it's going to be growing from here on in. Which is to say, and I did a radio interview just before I came on here, if you're looking for the best potential export market in the future for the United States, let it be the United States. Food insecurity in this country, and the most agriculturally blessed country in the entire world, averages at 10.4%. In some parts of the country, it's even higher than that. I live in Louisiana right now. Somehow we have food insecurity that is above the 10.4% average, and yet we also have an over 50% obesity rate. I'm not quite sure how we accomplish that, but we do amazing things. In general, though, one of the things that I learned from inflation was that, yes, people will complain, and people will say, I want lower prices, but they will pay the prices. They will pay to put food on the table. They will pay to get the eggs from his wife. They will pay if the things in the store cost a little bit more. And so I think first and foremost, we need to be thinking about our domestic market first. We've got a few signs that this is already beginning to happen. There's a lot of things to talk about with the recent, is it the dissolution of USAID? Is it the temporary pause of USAID? I don't know. But USAID buys almost $1 billion worth of US agricultural commodities to send them to different markets all around the world. We've been told for most of our lives that it's our responsibility to feed the world. Well, maybe it's our responsibility to feed ourselves first. Which brings me to the second part of the presentation. How do we understand what is going on in the White House and with President Trump and his foreign policy? I made a mistake here a couple of months ago, or 6 to 8 months ago. When I was on the road talking about the election, I was putting President Trump in conversation with figures like George Washington. I was thinking that he was going to be an isolationist, that America first meant he was going to turn inward, and that there was a good and robust American foreign policy tradition around that isolationism. It took all of 2 weeks after he won the election for me to realize that that was wrong, and that really he was invoking a different American foreign policy tradition, which is that of imperialism. The picture here, does anybody know which president? Raise your hand if you know who the president is that that picture is of on the screen right now. Just a few. That is former President William McKinley. He was president from 1898 to 1900. You probably know his vice president, Teddy Roosevelt, a lot better because he took over when McKinley was assassinated. President Trump cannot stop talking about this man. And the reason he can't stop talking about this man is because there's a lot of eerie similarities. He was a protectionist president who loved to raise tariffs on a bunch of different markets around the world. He oversaw the United States when it won the Spanish-American War, so when we took the Philippines and Puerto Rico and a bunch of different former Spanish colonies and tried to put them under US power. He also thought a lot about fiscal conservatism. He was the opposite of William Jennings Bryan and his Cross of Gold speech. We don't have to go through high school history again. But that's who McKinley is, and that's who President Trump admires. And this was a time when US foreign policy was absolutely imperial. Some people say that the things that President Trump are saying are outside of the bounds, that they're crazy. They wouldn't have been crazy in the early 1900s. That magazine article there from Puck that I have on the chart, it shows a bald eagle spreading its wings from Asia all the way to Panama, which was an obsession in the early 1900s for the United States even then. So we are returning in some sense to that imperialist foreign policy. The problem for us and for President Trump is he is trying to pull this off in a world that is multipolar. In a world where our relative share of political dominance and economic influence has begun to decline. I want to briefly illustrate that by that crazy US-Colombia trade spat that came out of nowhere just a week ago. Colombia's top export to the United States is oil. And that is a bad export to have to the United States because we have more oil than we know what to do with here. And I'll get to that at the end of the presentation. So President Trump wanted to make an example of Colombia and threaten tariffs on a country that he knew he had a lot of leverage over. Over that same weekend, Honduras came out and said, we actually don't like these things that the Trump administration is saying. We're going to look towards China maybe for help in the future with our economy. You didn't hear anything in the news about that. It was all about the Colombia trade spat. The flip side of this, though, and the thing that should worry you in this room, is that the Trump administration was willing to make an example out of Colombia by risking you. Because Colombia is one of the biggest corn importers in the entire world, number 4. They also import a lot of soybean meal and even a significant amount of soybeans. So yes, President Trump went away from those tariffs at the last second and claimed victory. The Colombian side also claimed victory as well. But what I want you to see here is that President Trump is cashing checks that sometimes you are going to have to pay, because U.S. agriculture is such an important part of how the United States makes foreign policy. So if you're thinking about what is the most important question to consider for the next 2 years when it comes to geopolitics, it is, does President Trump really mean these things? Is he bluffing? Is this all about making better trade deals in the rest of the world? Or does he really believe that tariff is the most beautiful word in the English language, and he's going to raise those tariffs no matter what, and no matter how much short-term pain that it causes in general? I said this last week, even as during my presentation he was talking about Canada and Mexico tariffs, and I thought about changing it, but I'm sticking to my guns. I think he's bluffing. I don't think he really believes in all this stuff. I think he wants better trade deals, and there are a couple countries that he's going to go after. I could be wrong about this. And this is one point I really want to emphasize to you over the next 2 years. It doesn't matter how brilliant I am, how great my models, how profound my grasp of history and all these other things. President Trump is a change agent. And unless you know somebody who's having breakfast with this man, you have no idea what's going on in his head. I don't have any idea what's going on in his head. If you read the books from his cabinet officials during the first administration, like H.R. McMaster, they talk about how he would get people in the room who disagreed with each other, and whoever had the last word was usually the person that he went with, and then sometimes a week later, he would just change his mind. Sometimes he would just be reflexively contrarian for the heck of it. And as a contrarian myself, I actually appreciate that. I like to take the opposite view a bunch of times. So we can talk about what the trajectory here is, but I'm going to give you some models and scenarios for how to think about this, understanding that a lot could change based on what's going on. This, by the way, is President Trump. That picture is President Trump and Xi Jinping sharing that beautiful piece of chocolate cake at Mar-a-Lago right before Trump decided to announce his big trade war against China in general. Now, why do I think President Trump is bluffing? Well, I think he's got a problem with leverage. The first is with inflation. I love this chart. This chart is showing you what Democrats think is going to happen with inflation over a 5-year time horizon versus Republicans. And you can see that as long as Joe Biden is president, Democrats think inflation is going to be low, and Republicans think inflation is going to be high. And as soon as President Trump took the office, Republicans said, inflation is going to be low, and the Democrats went back to inflation is going to be high. I'm giving you this because I don't think you can trust forecasts and projections and data like this, because it is all politically tinged. I would rather know what's going on with your input prices on the farms and the things that you're facing than with official projections on Bloomberg when it comes to inflation. So I want to paint a picture here of I think prices are probably going to be volatile and are probably going to be up from here. That is a contrarian viewpoint, but I look around the economy, and when I get away from the prognostications, I see things that worry me. This is the yield on the 30-year U.S. Treasury. The higher interest rates go, that means that the market is thinking that inflation is going to be higher and that the Fed is going to have to raise interest rates a little bit. Now, we are nowhere near the stagflation era, 1980s, early 1990s figures, but you can see that we are appreciably above anywhere we've been since the 2008 financial crisis. And crucially, the 30-year Treasury is pointing upwards. It is looking at what is happening in the market and saying, we don't quite buy this. We're thinking that prices might go up from here and that the Fed might have to react. Doubly disturbing for those of you in this room is the status of the US dollar. And this is something that the Trump administration has been talking about a lot. But if I'm right about that inflation call, and if I'm right about some of the other things that are happening in the US economy, the dollar's not going to get weaker at all. The dollar's probably going to continue to appreciate in value. We have this ironic thing happening where we are the flight to safety. We are the flight to security. And it confers upon us a normal political influence and enormous economic influence throughout the world. It also makes our exports less competitive. So even as we are trying to reset some of these trade relationships in the world, it's it's almost self-defeating because the dollar keeps going up the more that things are volatile in general. Let's go through a couple things in the economy itself. A can of Campbell's condensed tomato soup is up appreciably, and it seems to be pointing upwards as well. Natural gas prices in this country. It might not feel this way, but last year we had the lowest natural gas prices in this country on an annual basis in recorded history. In recorded history. I'm an investor and I'm a betting man. I would bet that we're not going to get the lowest natural gas prices in the year next year. One of the reasons that inflation has come off the boil a bit is simply because when you strip out the energy prices have been historically low. I'm not sure that that's going to continue. Look at shipping. Shipping never really recovered from the COVID-19 pandemic. It came off the boil a little bit, but again, you have things starting to trend up a little bit. And part of that is companies thinking about President Trump's trade wars and importing more stock ahead of time. And there's more demand for trying to get products out there in general. But here's one of the real kickers, because if you go back to every president since Eisenhower, there is only one president who earns the moniker of fiscal conservative, and he's not a Republican. It's Bill Clinton in his second term. Every single US presidential administration, I don't care if they're Democrat or Republican, likes to blow out the deficit. Talks a big game about fiscal conservatism, but as soon as they're in the office, it's goodies for everyone and spending all over the place. And the first Trump administration was particularly guilty of this. You've got an internal battle within the Trump administration right now, where some is about tax cuts and about more fiscal looseness, and others, like Scott Bessent, are saying, no, we really need to rein this in. We really need to be a little bit more disciplined with our spending. I will take the other side of that argument. I bet you that the profligate fiscal guys win just because they've been winning since the early 1950s, and that's also going to drive up prices in general. But here, I think, is the one that bothers me the most, which is the demographics in this country have reached, I won't say unprecedented, but we have the lowest and slowest demographic growth in this country since the 1900s. That includes World War I, and it includes World War II. We are simply not growing from a demographic perspective. At the same time, we have a migration crisis at our border. We are unable to figure out which immigrants we want to bring in legally because we want their skills or want them to become a part of the American story, and which ones we want to keep out and send back to the places that they're going. And you're seeing that with our population growth figures. You're seeing that with wages and how wages and labor supply is getting increasingly tight. That will get all the more so as a result of the deportations and sort of the strategy that the Trump administration is taking towards migration. One of the great superpowers of the United States has always been our ability to take the best and the brightest from other countries in the world and to integrate them into our economy and into our politics. And we have just not been able to do that over the past couple of decades, and it's not something I expect to change anytime soon. That's the 12-month CPI, and again, you can see it's not particularly high, but it's not low, and it's trending in the wrong direction. So one thing, no matter what happens with President Trump, whether he's bluffing or not, he's going to be dealing with higher prices for the American consumer, and that's something that's going to dictate the way that he behaves in his trade wars. The three top destinations for US exports are China, Mexico, Canada. And that's why I'm going to focus on them. If you want to talk about Russia, Ukraine, and other things happening in the world, we can save it for Q&A. But these are the three countries that I'm worried about the most from y'all's perspective. Let's start with China. This is my favorite map in the whole deck. And it's my favorite map in the whole deck because it communicates to you what a fundamentally weak geopolitical power China is. They are surrounded on all sides by US defense treaty allies. South Korea is a US defense treaty ally. Japan is a US defense treaty ally. The Philippines is a US defense treaty ally. Taiwan, I don't think China's going to invade Taiwan anytime soon. I don't lose any sleep about it. I don't think that because they don't have the ships, they don't have the planes, they don't have the Marines, they don't have the capacity to go and get it. It's been their top foreign policy priority to reclaim Taiwan since 1953. It's probably not going to happen anytime soon. The only friend that China has in the rest of East Asia is North Korea. And if you get into a bar fight and North Korea is the only friend that you're expecting to come to your rescue, you're going to lose the bar fight. And that's the situation that China is in right now. China, moreover, in a sort of an ironic twist, is an incredibly unequal country when it comes to wealth. They're supposed to be communist, but they're communist in all but name. The wealth concentration in the coastal areas of China and in their cities has become immense. And if you're wondering what keeps Xi Jinping up at night, it is not Taiwan and some of these other things. It's about how do I redistribute all of that money that is on the coast of China into the Chinese interior without A, setting off a peasant revolution, or B, having these wealthy cadres on the coast come for my head. because I'm taking their money. It's a really unpleasant place to be. And it's why I think in the short term, China's probably going to be willing to deal with us. They are probably going to do whatever they possibly can to avert some of the consequences of the trade war that is coming up. I joked just yesterday, where does China need to send its 10,000 troops so that its 10% tariffs get rescinded? Probably no easy place for them to do it. There's a lot of talk about Chinese demographics. I want to throw a little bit of cold water on that. This is a country of 1 billion plus people, hundreds of millions of whom live in the interior and have not joined the wealthy coastal elites in terms of their success. You've got parts of China that are equal to the population of countries like Iran or like Venezuela that are living on $5 a day or probably even less. So this can help you with demographics if you can pull off that redistribution of wealth. One other problem that has been happening for China is that the government has been trying as much as possible to stimulate consumption. It wants the Chinese people to consume more things, and in particular, it wants them to consume Chinese goods. And they just haven't been doing that. They continue to export more and more abroad, and the consumption numbers have actually been pretty low. All of, again, which is going to tell you that China's probably going to be a buyer of US agricultural products in the years ahead. If you look at sort of the last couple of years, it's been pretty good. If you look at this chart and you're a Democrat, you say, well, wait a minute, Jacob. All of this increase in Chinese purchases of US ag goods happens under the Biden administration, and now they're gone. Should we be worried? And if you're a Republican, you look at this chart and say, well, that's only because President Trump gave them the medicine in 2018. Biden's just taking credit for the situation that Mr. Trump created. Maybe, maybe not. That's a conversation we'll have over some bourbons. But you can see that even in the data, China is purchasing more US ag goods in general. And at least on the surface, it looks pretty good. Whether it's soybeans, whether it's corn, sorghum, even beef and chicken, China has been buying more. But here's the part that starts to worry me, and is why I'm going to tell you that China is a viable market for the next couple years, but not going forward. It's not sustainable. One of the first things President Trump did when he came into office was, instead of immediately raising tariffs on China, he said, we're going to do an investigation into whether China met its phase 1 trade deal requirements of purchases from US agricultural commodities. We don't need to do a study for that. They didn't. They didn't come close. They got 58% of the way there. They bought more corn than they said they were going to, but for everybody else, it wasn't a particularly pretty situation. Not only that, and this is the thing that should really concern us, over the past 10 to 15 years, even if in absolute terms that trade is increasing, our dependence on China as an end market has increased, even as their dependence on us has decreased. So you can see in terms of China's agricultural imports from the United States, that was 27% of the whole pie in 2009. It's down to 18% last year. Whereas for the United States in 2009, they were 13% of our agricultural exports. Now they're up to 19%. If you want to look at soybeans in particular, again, China's soybean imports from the United States that they are sourcing from us have declined from roughly 49% to around 31%. And this is the story where Brazil comes into the conversation, because our share of China's imports has begun to decline. And this is the picture that I think is going to repeat itself, not in the next year or two. I think in the next year or two, China's going to buy because it wants to make President Trump happy so it can deal with its economic problems. But 3 to 5 years from now, as soon as China can source these things from other places, they will. So don't be surprised if that Chinese market is not there when you think it's going to be. Mexico. I've been joking that Mexico has more trade leverage with us than they have since Santa Anna invaded the United States almost 150 years ago. Mexico has a lot of leverage over the United States right now, because if we're going to do the things that we've talked about doing, we really do need Mexico. Now, they had an election themselves last year. Claudia Sheinbaum was elected president. She was elected president with 60% of the vote. Not only that, she has a supermajority in Mexico's Congress, which means she can change the Constitution at will. Her approval rating, and this is from last week, so I don't know how Mexicans are reacting to her skillful negotiations in the trade war, was at 80%. Can you imagine a US president with 80% approval ratings? I don't even think Bush got there after 9/11. Now, what does Claudia Sheinbaum want to change the Mexican Constitution to do? Well, let's take her at her word. This is from Mexico's National Development Plan 2019 to 2023. She wants to achieve self-sufficiency in corn and beans, and then 3 years later in rice and beef and pork and poultry and eggs and milk. She wants that to decline considerably as well. So here is a populist, popular, state-oriented Mexican politicians saying, we really don't want to import that much from the United States going forward. Now, it's nice to want things. My 2-year-old wants a pony. It's another thing to actually do it in practice. And over that same time period, actually, Mexico's imports from the United States have gone up. And as you can see on this chart, their food self-sufficiency has gone down in general. One of the interesting things about the US-Mexico-Canada free trade renegotiation under the first Trump administration is actually Mexican imports from the United States increased markedly as a result over that same time period. And again, that goes back into the dollar and some of these other things that I'm talking about. So this is a chart that I'm sure the Trump administration has burned into its mind and wants to bring up to a more even level. But I said, though, that Mexico has leverage. What is that leverage? Well, first, they're dealing with a migration crisis, too. The migration crisis at our border is not like it was in the 1990s when it was primarily Mexicans who were trying to get to our border. The people who are showing up at our border are Venezuelans and Ecuadorians and Hondurans and Guatemalans and Nicaraguans. And they get to Mexico before they get to the United States. So Mexico can meaningfully help us trap some of those migrants or stop that flow of migrants northward if they want to. And this is something the Mexican government has been talking about for some time now. What about fentanyl? The red line is U.S. seizures of fentanyl at the U.S.-Mexico border. That blue line is Mexican seizures of fentanyl at the U.S.-Mexico border, almost through the end of 2023. I don't know if you noticed it, but immediately after President Trump was elected, Mexico suddenly made a record fentanyl bust at the border. And now they're going to dispatch 10,000 Mexican troops to the border as well to stave off that first 25% of tariffs. By the way, is that the Mexican military? Is that the Mexican police? Is it the Mexican National Guard? Are they in the pockets of the cartels? We don't know the answers to any of these questions. But Mexico knows that fentanyl is a problem, and that they can at least signal to us that they're going to do something and have some leverage in general. Everybody had talked about over the last year that Mexico has surpassed China as our biggest trading partner. And this was seen in especially Washington think tank circles as a wonderful and momentous development. Nobody thought to pull the next chart, which is, well, what do Mexican imports from China look like over the same time period? We haven't decreased our dependence on China at all. It just goes into Mexico first and then comes across the border. And that's one of the reasons why the Mexican government for the last 6 weeks has been saying, hey, President Trump, you see all these counterfeit Chinese goods we've been seizing at the border? See all these ways that we're helping to make sure that these Chinese goods don't get north and into the United States market? So Mexico has a lot of leverage here, and we should pay attention to that leverage because they have been announcing all sorts of plans, whether it's with nearshoring, whether it's with manufacturing, whether it's with energy and electricity, billions of dollars worth of money going into making Mexico more self-sufficient, and we should take them at their word. Just for fun, that is a political cartoon from yesterday from one of Mexico's biggest papers after President Trump took off the tariffs. They weren't particularly afraid. They look at the United States and think Trump is literally shooting himself in the foot. So you can agree or disagree. That's what the Mexican narrative is on what's happening in the White House. The situation is not as rosy for Canada, although Canada does have some leverage as well. Their imports have expanded faster than our exports to them have expanded over this time period. But as I mentioned before, their biggest export to the United States is oil. And we really don't need their oil that much. I think that's one of the reasons that the Trump administration has pushed so hard on Canada in the last couple of weeks. The problem, though, is when you look at, especially in the upper Midwest, supply chains and how much of that is dependent on trade with Canada, you're getting a 40, 50, even 60% of state GDPs in the upper Midwest dependent on that trade with Canada in general. And that's why I think that the whole thing about Canada with President Trump, I think, is more about Justin Trudeau than it is about actual politics and economics. I think he doesn't like Trudeau. I think he thinks Trudeau is this sophisticated guy who has announced himself as the leader of the woke world and looked down on Trump in the first administration. And he saw that Trudeau was really weak and that he could help show him the exit stage right by doing what he did over the last couple of weeks. I think as soon as we get a new Canadian leader, probably Mr. Trump is going to be singing a different tune. And he'll have to sing a different tune because Canadian leaders are not just going to bow down to whatever he wants. He can't keep making the 51st state quip and expect that the Canadians are going to take it lying down. They're not going to. The last sort of thing that I want to go in here, and this will be a real fire hose, is that one of the reasons President Trump doesn't have a whole lot of leverage here is because we don't know how to make things in this country anymore. I've been reading this nerdy book, The Construction of Gothic Cathedrals, lately. It's about how we literally have forgotten how to build the immense and beautiful cathedrals that are in Europe, if you've seen any of them. We literally don't know how the stonemasons did what they did to build these things. Now, we can build planes and computers and all sorts of things that they couldn't do in the medieval era. We have cures to diseases, but we have forgotten how to do this. Ditto this, by the way, for the pyramids. Nobody knows how the Egyptians actually made the pyramids. It is so confounding that there are real people out there who think it's evidence that aliens came to the world and dropped the pyramids in and then left. All of which is to say is that civilizations can forget how to do things. And we have forgotten in this country how to make things. China is the country that makes things in our world. They have over 35% share of gross manufacturing production in the world. Our share is roughly 12%. If you want to say, oh, but we make the really important stuff, right? Okay, fine. Like if you go to value added, what, is that 16% there versus China's 27%? And when you add in the rest of the world, that's well above 50%. You want just a couple of examples? There's no country in the world today, including us, that can make a semiconductor start to finish. It's a completely globalized supply chain. Taiwan has the factories. Japan and South Korea have all these specialty chemicals that you need. The Dutch, of all people, have a 100% monopoly on the equipment that goes in the factories in Taiwan to make the chips. We do a lot of the software and design. The much vaunted United States Navy, which is supposed to patrol the oceans and safeguard American power and global trade, we don't make ships anymore. Our percentage of global shipbuilding capacity is less than 2%. And it would take a long time to try and fix that. Rare earth metals and materials and other elements that are critical to industrial processes, we don't refine these in the United States anymore. We don't refine them in the United States, not because they're actually rare, but because it's really costly and environmentally destructive. And we thought China should do it, and we should just import them cheaply. I work with a guy who is CEO of a startup that is trying to refine some of these rare earths inside of the United States. I asked him, hey, let's say the Trump administration came to you and said, no cost too high, what would it take for you to actually refine some of these materials in the United States going forward? He said 5 to 10 years minimum, and that's if everything is perfect. We get most of these things from China and Canada. Solar panels, between 74% and 96% come from China. Cell towers, all the little radios and switches that go in cell towers, we make a grand total of 0 of that in the United States. We get it all from Japan and South Korea and Taiwan. So you want 5G, you want all these autonomous networks and smart agriculture and smart drones, better start building those radios and switches in the United States as well. Pharmaceuticals, this is one of the ones that really gets me going. Generic drugs, so your ibuprofens, your Tylenol, some of these generic antibiotics and things like that, we're getting 31% from China. Another 26% from India in general. Fertilizer, our friends in Canada have the potash market completely on lockdown. Everything else is coming from China, Russia, or Belarus. We don't do this stuff anymore. We get it from the rest of the world. Agriculture and machinery. If I was advising the Trudeau government, I would say stop going after Trump and his stupid jokes and just show him this chart. Show him that over 40% of the agricultural machinery that is coming into this country is ultimately imported from Canada in general. So I ask you again, is he bluffing? I think he's bluffing. I think he knows that he's at a moment where US influence is at its maximum, and he does want to renegotiate some of these deals in ways that help the US market. If he's not bluffing, then inflation is going to get even higher than I'm expecting, and we're going to be in a very difficult world. And it'll be important here to separate signal from noise. I think the fact that he threatened Mexico and Canada and then took it off, that I think is a sign to me that he is bluffing, and that we shouldn't necessarily be afraid of the things that he's doing, but should have all of this in mind. Okay, I have 7 minutes left. Corn and soybeans. You guys are unique in the US agricultural complex in the sense of how deeply intertwined you are with energy. In some ways, when I'm prepping to talk to this specific audience, it has to be as much an energy preparation for me as it does an ag preparation and a geopolitical preparation. And that's because roughly half of the corn and soybeans that are grown in this country ultimately find their way into the US energy complex. Now for corn, this is an old story. This starts with ethanol back in the mid-2000s. For soybeans, this is a more recent development that goes around the advent of renewable diesel. And here, in addition to multipolarity and the changing of the guard in agriculture globally, we also need to think about something that is happening in the US energy complex. One of the reasons that President Trump can throw his weight around is that for the first time in almost 100 years, the US is a net energy exporter. Joe Biden, Barack Obama, George Bush, they might have wanted to pursue some of the imperialist foreign policies that President Trump is pursuing, but there was no way that they could, because the United States, since the 1950s and the 1960s, has imported energy from abroad and was completely dependent on those imports of energy from abroad. And as you can see on this chart, that just began to change in the early 2020s. The shale revolution is a little bit long in the tooth. Really, the technology came out around 2008, 2009, but in terms of actual impact on our energy flows, it's been just the last couple of years. And it confers tremendous power, but also some disadvantages for the US consumer and producer in general. Now look at how we actually consume energy in this country today. It's a combination of petroleum, natural gas, and some renewables there. What I want you to see is that the lion's share of fuel that is going towards transportation is still petroleum. Natural gas is big in industrial and commercial, renewable, even coal and nuclear. They are also going into industrial, residential, and commercial. But you're still talking about 80% of the energy that we use to transport things in this country is still coming from petroleum. Not only that, I don't think that's going to change anytime soon, because our electricity market is about to get strained in a major way. In the 1950s and 60s, we had the advent of refrigerators and air conditioning and all of these other power-hungry things that required a lot of electricity consumption and energy consumption. And that's why you saw massive increases in electricity consumption over that time period. For the last 20 or 30 years, electricity consumption growth has been going down. That's one of the amazing things about the digital revolution. We've actually been consuming less and less energy as we do these things. But that's about to change, because whether it's artificial intelligence, whether it's data centers, whether it's AI, no matter who you talk to, whether it's McKinsey or Princeton University or the US government, we're talking about somewhere between tripling or 10xing our energy consumption over the next 5 to 10 years. Not only that, the grid is not really built for that. These areas in red are places that are going to have power blackouts probably over the next 5 to 10 years as a result of all this. Meanwhile, we are exporting more energy than we ever had before. We used to export almost no LNG abroad. Last year, we were one of the biggest sources of European LNG imports out there. We have literally been keeping the lights and the heat on in Europe during the Russia-Ukraine war as a result of our LNG exports. So our natural gas, in some sense, is already taken for. Last but not least, oil prices. If you want to see where Joe Biden lost the election, it wasn't at the debate. It wasn't when he was falling off stages and things like that. It's when oil hit $5 a barrel and stayed relatively elevated. Well, I should say diesel $5 a barrel and gasoline slightly below that. But if you want to know when he lost the election, it was right there. And if you think President Trump doesn't know this and doesn't know that he absolutely has to keep gasoline prices down if he wants to follow through on some of the things that he's talking about, he knows that that's exactly what he needs to do. All of which is to say, you should be rooting for two things. Number one, you want him to drill, baby drill as much as possible, but you also want him to export, baby export as much as possible. Because if you surge production and you don't export it abroad, then fuel prices could collapse in this country. And that will obviously mean bad things for biofuels and renewable diesel. If we're exporting it abroad, though, and the prices of natural gas and oil start increasing for the American consumer, which is what I think is going to happen, suddenly President Trump is going to look at biofuels and renewable diesel and things like that and see a major advantage for him in the context of what he's trying to accomplish. I think that's going to be one of the biggest changes from the first administration to the second administration. We've got a lot more renewable diesel capacity that has come online. Ethanol production has also been going up slightly. And this is where the trade war is also incredibly advantageous in terms of the US energy complex. The EPA last year thought that renewable diesel was primarily going to come from soybean oil, canola oil, and then other fats and greases, and that was mostly going to be domestically sourced. They were shocked last year when that wasn't what happened at all. First of all, the United States was importing renewable diesel from abroad, where we don't know the actual feedstock source, and then we were importing used cooking oil and tallow and canola in order to meet some of these renewable diesel demands. That's US trade of animal fats and vegetable oils. You can see that those imports have increased considerably, which is why if you want to protect the biofuels industry in this country, and that is something I think the Trump administration wants to do, you absolutely want to go at China, and you absolutely want to have a conversation with Canada about these things, because the biofuels renewable diesel conversation has been completely skewed by the existence of really countries that are dumping these things into the US market. This is something I think the Trump administration is absolutely going to attack, and that is something that should give you some hope for these things going forward. If I'm right about that, you're also going to be sitting on a lot of things like soybean meal. This is a market I'm fairly bullish on. Start thinking about the types of livestock that you could raise with all of that cheap soybean meal. If you don't want to do that, maybe we're not the low-cost producer of soybeans themselves in the global marketplace, but we can certainly be for soybean meal if we meet some of these quotas on renewable diesel. And there are countries like Indonesia, Vietnam, that are not even in our top 10 for the most part for where our soybean meal exports go right now. So there's a lot of change out there and a lot of opportunity that we can find in general. I'm getting to the end, and I haven't gotten to the health stuff yet, so I'm going to leave it for Q&A. But if you want to talk about Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and what he means, maybe we can save it for the Q&A. But I want to leave you on a positive note. The most common question I get when I'm giving presentations is, Jacob, how do you stay sane? It feels like everything is going to hell in a handbasket, that the world is getting worse, that morality is declining. Well, some scientists published an article in Nature where they got access to US survey data from 1949 to 2019 that was asking Americans the same question. Do you have faith in the future? Do you trust your neighbor? Do you think the young generation is ready to take over? And 84% of the time, Americans said, the world is getting worse, morality is declining, I don't trust my neighbor, and future generations are not that great. They didn't have that kind of data for the entire world, but if you look at this map here, the countries that are in red, they had data from 1996 to 2007 for these countries, which I regard as the apex of human civilization based on the music that came out in the world during this time period. And roughly 80% of the people during that time period said, yes, the world is getting worse, I don't trust my neighbor, my children, I don't recognize the morals that they have, the world is becoming a bad place. And these psychologists attributed this to two things. Number one, our brains like negative news. It's like junk food for our brains. And we're getting it beamed into our brains more than ever before. These social media platforms literally give us the things that are going to give them more clicks. And this is true right up into the news publications as well. Negative things, people click on it more. They stay on it more, and everybody knows that. When you're driving down the highway and there's an accident, you don't want to stop and look at the accident, but you're going to stop and look at the accident. We're all going to stop, and then the traffic jam is going to pile up. The second interesting thing they found, though, was that most people 20, 30 years later forget how bad things were in the moment. They have nostalgia, where it's this constant feedback loop where, oh, do you remember the good old days when everything was good? Today is the day that sucks. Today is the day that morality is declining and things were better before. So I want to leave you with this little thought experiment. This is a picture of Wall Street in 1896. I want you to sit with the picture for a moment. Imagine what it's like to be there. There's no electric light, so you can imagine how dark this street probably is at night. No electric cars, it's horses and buggies, so you can imagine how that smells in New York City in the summer. Pretty conservative clothing, maybe you've got a whiff of starch, things like that. The road is probably not paved, so you can hear the crunching of gravel or sand underneath shoes there. So that's 1896. That's Times Square 15 years later. And this is why I say the last multipolar environment in the world was the 1890s. And it was a time of incredible technological effervescence, of cultural transformation. There were so many different opportunities out there. And I think the exact wrong thing to do in the current international environment is to get in the fetal position and say, things are bad, or the government needs to come save me, or I'm not sure, there's all this uncertainty and volatility. There's always uncertainty and volatility. If I have the privilege of coming back here 15, 20 years from now, I bet we'll be saying things like, do you remember 2025? Do you remember how great our civil discourse was? Do you remember how nice we were to each other? Remember how Gen Z was really taking up the baton from future generations? Today is when things are so bad. I asked ChatGPT to imagine what Fargo would look like in 2039. That's what it gave me. I don't know if that's particularly realistic or not, but if you take one thing away from my presentation, whether I'm right or wrong about all the politics, is that these are the years of plenty. These are the years to invest. These are the years to jump on the changes that are happening, because when I look out at the global marketplace, I see change and I see opportunity. If we continue on this trajectory 10, 15 years from now, we could have some big problems, but the people who are going to do the best are the ones that see the change in front of them and are not afraid to go tackle it. Whether it looks like that or the ChatGPT image or not, I'm not sure. But I think now is actually the good time in politics, and don't be caught 10, 20 years from now into looking back and saying, man, times were good then. So with that, I'll be quiet and happy to take questions and answers, and especially disagreements. Thank you.
All right. Well, we do have a few questions that have already come in. I'll read them off here and let you take a crack at them. Again, we have QR codes. If you'd like to submit a question, we've probably got 5-6 minutes here. We can answer some questions. So rapid fire for you.
Let's do it.
Did the U.S. government, when we're talking about Ethiopia exports and wheat, how did that happen? Did they get money? Did U.S. government give them money to help? Did their own country give them money to help? How does that impact U.S. farmers now?
That was the Ethiopian government. They can take a lot of credit for that. They went out into the market, got a lot of good consultants to tell them what they were doing wrong, and then they supported their farmers by going out and fronting the cost for equipment and technology and seeds like that. So no, that was not a U.S. goal. I think U.S. wheat would love to have Ethiopia as an export market in general. So that was an example of a country using resources that were already out there, applying good government policy, and then being able to surge production. And they did that during a civil war. It's a pretty remarkable transformation that they were able to accomplish.
Okay, second question here. Will the BRICS currency and or participating nations be an issue for the U.S.?
Maybe I'm behind the questioner here, but I have not heard of the development of a BRICS currency. You can wake me when the BRICS actually start doing things beyond just issuing press releases and public statements. BRICS itself, I don't put a whole lot of stock in because those nations don't have a lot of interest together and they're not actually doing things together. But as a symbol for how the world is changing, yes, there are going to be other blocks that are going to rise that are going to be really interesting. But I wouldn't focus too much on BRICS. You should focus on how the European Union just had a free trade agreement with South America, with the Mercosur countries in South America. We should be thinking about which country is going to get a true free trade agreement with India. This is something the Trump administration pursued the first time around, is probably going to pursue the second time around. Look at what Turkey is doing in the Middle East, the way that it's sort of building an economy of scale around that. So I don't worry so much about BRICS, but as a symptom of what is happening in the world, yes, it's an important signal.
How likely is it that China's demographic structure collapses in the next 10 years?
Yeah, I don't think that China's demographic structure is going to collapse in the next 10 years. I think there's been a lot of pessimism out there, and I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about just how resilient and how transformative China is. I sort of tried to say this, but I'll try to say it more pointedly. China has hundreds of millions of people living in the interior who are living on less than $5 a day. They do not need to be having lots more babies or getting lots more immigrants if they can just take those people and bring them up to the lower middle class. That'll give them a demographic boost just as much of any of these other things. Demographics are really difficult to predict. You're literally trying to predict how many babies people are going to want to have 5-10 years from now. I use it as a snapshot for what are the problems today, but not as something that is truly predictive going forward. If I'm wrong about that, it's not a question about China's demographics. It's about China's attempt to redistribute wealth to the interior failing. And if that fails, yes, you might see major problems for the Chinese government, maybe even the loss of legitimacy for the Chinese Communist Party. But everything I see says they're going to muddle through. China's probably never going to be weaker in our lifetimes than they are today, which is why I'm trying to get across to you, sell as much as you can to China and do it for as long as you possibly can, but start preparing the backup plan. 2-3 years from now, anything you send to China, try to think of it as bonus. Don't think of it as the core of what you're doing.
These are great questions. These are great questions. You guys are doing great. Will RFK get confirmed? And what does that mean for agriculture? I think I saw he made it out of committee just a few minutes ago.
He made it out of committee? Well, I'll have to get my magic 8-ball to see if he'll actually get confirmed. What it's going to mean for agriculture, where's my, I can maybe give you a couple slides if we still have it up here. No, I don't have to do that. Look, RFK Jr. Has said a lot of things about seed oils and about health, and he's sort of assembled this coalition of nutritionists and mushroom shamans and everything else who were talking, yeah, there you go, nutritionists, mushroom shamans, and moms who are all together supporting him. And maybe there is a world in which RFK Jr. pushes these things. And I don't want to dismiss the fact that there has been some change in how US consumers are behaving. I don't know if any of you have heard of the Athletic Brewing Company. This is a company that nobody wanted to touch, nobody wanted to invest in a couple of years ago. They're a non-alcoholic beer company. And they figured out that the reason that non-alcoholic beer tastes so bad is because the process of getting the alcohol out strips the alcohol out and it just tastes flat and awful. And so what they decided to do instead was to brew from scratch at the beginning a beer that actually tasted like beer without having the alcohol. And now you've got companies like Dr. Pepper and other falling over themselves, trying to invest millions in this country. They're probably going to have $1 billion valuation, which is to say something is changing with the US consumer. If you're looking at millennials and Gen Z in particular, they are spending at a higher rate on things like health and nutrition than previous generations. So I regard that as a real trend. And if you can market a product or build a product around that particular niche, you might be able to make billions of dollars. At the same time, I don't think RFK Jr. is going to be able to follow through on a lot of these things. As he himself said, his boss loves a Big Mac and loves a Diet Coke and strong-armed him into taking this picture. More than that, one of the investors who taught me on the investing side of the business how to do things once told me, Jacob, rule number one, never ever short fat people. Never. And I'm not going to do that, and I won't make that mistake. Think about Coca-Cola. When Coca-Cola first started, they had literal cocaine in their drinks. They took the cocaine out, they're still around. We're still drinking the Coca-Cola. So I do think there are niche opportunities in the health space, and I think there are cultural changes happening around that. I don't think that RFK Jr. is going to take away a lot of these things and that he threatens to, and that if he tries to, the Trump hammer will come down on him. So a little nuanced answer there. There is some change happening, change that I would encourage you to explore on the edges as entrepreneurs, but don't run for the hills just because RFK Jr. is saying crazy things.
I've got two more quick questions here. Immediate long-term trade agreement outlook. Are we done with trade agreements? Are they going to look different? I keep asking this question. Is it the end of free trade?
It's been the end of free trade since 2010s. So trade globalization has been declining since 2010. This is not something that began with President Trump. I would actually say it began with President Obama. He picked a little fight over chicken and tires with China back in 2014. And that's where I would really pinpoint the beginning of this. The short-term outlook for free trade agreements, or trade agreements in general, is very bad. I think Trump is trying to convince everyone with all of his moves just how scary he can be. But I think he wants deals, and he wants deals selectively with the countries that are going to help the U.S. the most. So I think all this U.S., Mexico, Canada, that's about the USMCA renegotiation that's coming up. I think that'll get done. I think Trump really wants to deal with India. I think he'll push hard on that. I think he might try to push on the European Union, or it's going to be a lot harder for him to do that. So over the longer term, over the 2 to 4 year time horizon, I actually expect you should see some more trade agreements, but it's not going to go back to free trade. It's not going to be everybody join the WTO and hold hands and sing Kumbaya. It's going to be no. We want trade agreements with these countries, and also if you don't do what we say you're going to do, or if you don't buy our particular products, you will get these tariffs or these consequences.
Okay. Last question here. Do you see the focus on ag and energy and carbon capture enduring?
I do see it enduring, and I see it enduring for as long as the U.S. energy complex is obsessed with exporting abroad. If I'm wrong about that, or if the U.S. energy complex is not exporting abroad, and they're just producing more and more, and energy prices here are plummeting, then I'm wrong, and things are going to get a little bit dicey here. But no, I think that that is something that is going to continue for the foreseeable future. I'm really curious to see if one of the things that President Trump pushes Europe on, in particular, for example, is sustainable aviation fuel. I know you're going to talk about SAF a little bit later, but from my geopolitical perch, the place that has the biggest mandates and the biggest demand for SAF is Europe. But they want nothing to do with soybeans and corn as a feedstock. They want it to be synthetic or some of these other things. The only country in the world that has the regulatory demand and the lack of capacity to produce is Japan. And they don't have enough to satisfy all the things that we're talking about in this country. So if you could get Europe, for instance, to say, hey, we'll scratch your back, and in addition, we want you to reserve 15% or 20% of your SAF quota for U.S. feedstocks that are vegetables or that are corn or soybeans in general, that could be really positive. So I'm sorry, I rambled a little bit there. The short answer to that question is yes. I think the relationship between ag and energy is going to be enduring. And when you're thinking about U.S. foreign policy in the next 5 to 10 years, we have to do something that none of us have done in our lifetimes. Treat us like an energy superpower. It's one of our biggest sources of leverage over different countries, and you are already seeing how President Trump is wielding that. And in particular, for corn and soybeans in this room, you are part of that complex. You are part of the leverage that the Trump administration thinks it has when it's going and thumping away at Canada and Colombia.
All right, thank you. Let's give him a round of applause. And you'll be around for a little while if they have questions?
I will be here all day. So.
He's going to be here all day. So if you have more questions, please find him, bring a bourbon, have a conversation. Talk politics, he likes that. All right, let's transition a little bit and talk a little bit about the 2025 growing season. What did we learn last year? What are we looking forward to in the year ahead? Now remember to use the QR code on the table for questions. I'd like to introduce Brad Rippey. Now, Brad is a meteorologist in the USDA office of the chief economist, managing the weekly weather and crop bulletin and contributing to the U.S. North American Drought Monitor. A graduate of Penn State, which I didn't know that, Brad. Brad has been with the USDA since 1998, a longtime columnist for WeatherWise magazine. Help me welcome Brad Rippey.
Good morning, everybody. Great talk, Jacob. It's going to be a tough act to follow, but at least I'm not talking about geopolitics. I'm going to talk about weather, which some might argue is even harder than geopolitics. As I found out last night at dinner, some of you may have heard me before and didn't associate the name with the voice that you hear on your local radio station. A lot of folks, these smaller radio stations, do pick up our stories from USDA radio. We just had a retirement in the USDA radio office. Gary Crawford retired after 50 years with USDA, 1974 to 2024. So he hung it up, and now with the hiring freeze in the federal government, they can't fill that position. So right now we're down to Rod Bain in the USDA radio office. So you're going to be hearing Rod for a while until we can get some more people back into that office. They're down 2 at this point. So since some of you, again, may have heard me, but can't put the face with the voice, I'll just give myself a quick introduction. I was born in West Virginia, so a little bit different look to the land than what you have here in North Dakota. And people ask, how in the world, I'm not a farmer, but how did I end up in agricultural meteorology? And I think the root of that is that my grandparents were specialty crop farmers in southern West Virginia. And although we did not have day-to-day activities associated with that farm, we lived elsewhere, we were exposed to that a lot in our childhood. And so I was exposed to quite a bit of agriculture, didn't even think I really knew it at the time. Eventually, I knew I wanted to get into meteorology, so I went to Penn State, which at the time was the premier school, still is really, for meteorology in the eastern United States. When I came out, I was trained as a forecaster. I have never been a forecaster in my professional life. I started out in satellite meteorology. I went to the Climate Prediction Center for 8 years. But when a job opened up at USDA in the late 90s, I jumped at it, and I've been there ever since in the office of the chief economist. I also picked up some responsibilities in the late 90s that involved the brand new, at that time, U.S. Drought Monitor. I became one of the 6 original authors of that product. I'm one of 2 of these 6 originals still drawing the lines for the U.S. Drought Monitor. I'll talk more about that in a little bit. So again, just to give a little bit of background here, I'm told that if you take West Virginia, that crumpled up piece of paper that's West Virginia, smooth it out, it's actually bigger than the state of North Dakota, or so I'm told. It's a very hilly area, and the place where my grandparents' farm was, the land rose pretty sharply to the west and south and fell pretty sharply to the east and north. And they were perched pretty far up into the mountains. And that's today's image of what was the Chase farm. After my grandparents passed away, it was passed to one of my mom's brothers. He ran the farm until he passed away. And then none of my cousins wanted the farm, so it was sold out of the family in 2007. That farmhouse was built in 1870. So by the time the Great Depression rolled around, it was already 60 some odd years old. That's the house that I remember from my childhood. You can see the slope of the land. That's to the south there on one side, and it fell off pretty sharply as you went to the east and north. My grandparents, that was 13 years after they got married and had four children. I love the corn shocks in the background there. That was how they dried their corn down at that time. Not much mechanization at that time, obviously, in the 30s and 40s. As the years rolled by, the farm operation continued. I tell people that they were kind of the original farm-to-table movement before that was even a thing. They grew mostly specialty crops, a lot of vegetables and fruits. There wasn't much land to work with. They grew enough wheat and hay to keep the animals going, but for the most part, it was specialty crops. More than once as a child, they would send us up into the cherry trees with a bucket, picking cherries, or going out to the garden to get strawberries or snap beans. So we did do that for them when we were there, but good memories. Then the grandchildren started rolling in. I was born in the 60s. That's me with my grandmother there on the right. And then as the family continued to grow, a lot of gatherings over the years. One thing in that right-hand photo, notice that there was never a down moment. If you were taking care of family or taking care of the farm, there was never an idle moment. Obviously, it was a church Sunday. You can tell how everybody's dressed there in that 1970 image. But both my grandparents are peeling apples in that picture. So they were probably getting ready for lunch. And so they probably had to pull them out of the kitchen to come out for the family photo, but they continued to work right through the photo. My grandmother's peeling apples, grandfather's got a knife in his hand. So that is farm life as I grew up in the 60s and 70s. All right, enough about that. I am talking about weather, I promise. Last time I was in North Dakota, it was at the behest of the Red River Farm Network. They had me out for the Big Iron Farm Show about a year and a half ago. Had a good time with Don Wick and his crew. And it rained while we were talking, and you couldn't hear yourself think with that rain pounding down on the roof. Other than that, it was a fantastic visit there, late summer of 2023. All right, I am getting into the weather now after that introduction. And I do want to talk about sort of the gorilla in the room. And, it's kind of a boogeyman in the sense of talking about changing weather, changing climate. But it's something that if you don't acknowledge and recognize in your farm operations, you're just going to give the advantage to somebody else. So we do have to acknowledge that weather changes, climate does change. We're not going to talk about causes or things like that or where we're going from here, but there have been some changes in my lifetime. You guys, a lot of you older than me, you've recognized that there's been some significant changes in weather and climate patterns over time. So this is North Dakota average temperature during we'll call it the warm season, April to September, going all the way back to 1895 to present. And I've highlighted some of the real warm years or the real warm growing seasons and the real cold growing seasons. Unfortunately, we don't have a whole lot of folks left that remember the Great Depression era, the 1930s, the Dust Bowl era. But for many, many years, 1936 stood as the warmest, hottest growing season on record. That was finally broken in 1988. And since then, we've had a number of rather hot years, whether it be 2006, 2012, and most recently 2021. 2024 was pretty warm, but it wasn't in record territory. But then there's some cold years too. The most recent really chilly year growing season we had was 2004. Before that, 92 and 93 were unusually chilly, right after Mount Pinatubo and during the year of the flood in 93. There was a real cool stretch in the mid-60s, and there was another cool stretch in the early 50s, 50, 51. One thing I want to point out is that during the actual growing season, North Dakota, this is specific to North Dakota, has been relatively immune from warming during the growing season. I threw a trend line on there for the last 50 years, 1975 to 2024. You notice that the warming is only about a half a degree over the last 50 years, or about a degree per century of warming rate. So the overall warming has not been during the growing season, which is kind of interesting. It's not true everywhere, but it's certainly true in this part of the country. Now, if you look at October to March, we'll call that the cold season, the warming has been much more pronounced, on the order of over 2 degrees or over 4 degrees per century of warming that has taken place in that October to March timeframe. And I lived in Wisconsin for a couple of years when I was younger, in the 70s. Those were really cold winters, and so we have kind of clawed our way out of that. We still have cold winters from time to time. 96, 97 was a memorable one. 2013, 2014 was memorable. We've had a couple others since then, but we've had that trend of warmer winters overall. Again, tremendous ups and downs from year to year, but the trend certainly is warmer for the winters than during the summers, a much steeper trend line. I'm going to parse it down a little bit more and look at high and low temperatures, except this time I'm going to take it the whole calendar year. So we're looking at maximum temperatures only, calendar year, January to December. And again, you don't see a whole lot of remarkable warming in the last 50 years during the daytime. The overall trend is about a degree warmer over the last 50 years. You still get your noticeable spikes, 87, 88, 2006, 2012, 2021, still stick out like a sore thumb. And then you've got some of those really cool years like 96 or 2019, the year of the flood. Look at that 1950-51 also, how chilly it was for the maximum temperatures that calendar year. But again, that overall trend, last 50 years, just 1 degree warmer. But look at the nighttime temperatures. This is where you can really see that change. We have warmed at a rate of 2 degrees over the last 50 years at night, 4 degrees per century if you extrapolate it over 100 years. And you can see how it's rare to even have nighttime temperatures for an annual basis actually below the 20th century trend anymore. It doesn't happen very often. Last time we were substantially below that was 1996. If you go back to the early first half of the 20th century, it was routinely much, much cooler at night. Focused a lot on temperature. What about the precipitation patterns? Once again, there's huge year-to-year variability. You get these big highs, big wet years, and then incredibly dry years. Look at the difference between 2019 and 20. 21 was a drought year, so we have these huge spikes. Overall trend is not that great for North Dakota. We've only seen it get a little over an inch wetter over the last 50 years, 1.4 inches or so. So in spite of these spikes all over the place, you draw a trend line through it, and the overall trend is not that remarkable. One thing that has changed, we can blame some on the climate and some on human activities, is how the Red River spikes or the Red River flooding occurs. If you look, other than 1882 and 1997, flooding was very uncommon in the Red River Valley during the first half of the 20th century. Look at those peak flows. Again, this 1897 was before this, 1882 was before the records were kept. But there was really no year where we had a flow of 10,000 cubic feet per second all the way up until we got to 1943. Then we had 52, and then we had the 10-year floods, 69, 79, 89, all pretty bad floods in the valley. And that brought us to 97. It broke the 10-year cycle, but if you are from here and lived through it, nobody will ever forget 1997, the year of the flood, the year Grand Forks flooded and downtown burned. And then since then, we've had a pretty high frequency of flood events, spring flood events in the Red River Valley, 2001, 2006, 9 and 11. But as the defenses have been bolstered, it's reduced the impact to some degree. And so some of that with the building is, when you constrict the flow of the river, that is going to obviously bring the river up, the runoff's going to increase, and as that water flows northward, it can increase the risk of ice jam flooding and so forth. But you talk to somebody 100 years ago, and they're like, what Red River flood? Of course, Devil's Lake was a lot lower then too, so it was just a drier time overall. A lot of factors play into the Red River flooding. One of those is snowfall, and this is just specific to Fargo here, so it's not the entire basin. But you can see from say the 50s and 60s on through the 90s, we did see a pretty sharp increase in snowfall accumulations in Fargo. Not every big snowfall year leads to a flood, but if the timing of everything with the melt-off and so forth is just right, it can lead to big flooding. Look at 1997. That's actually the winter of 96, 97. All-time record snowfall in Fargo and elsewhere in the valley. The way it melted off, it pushed everything to new heights for the time. 2009, 2011, no stranger. But then 2023, winter of 2022-23, a pretty big snowfall year. but no significant flooding. So it does depend on antecedent conditions like soil moisture and other factors. So you can't just go a one-to-one correlation, but certainly snowfall does have an impact. I do have 1897 on there, so the 1897 flood obviously at the time was a snowfall record for the season. Days with heavy precipitation. Again, I'm focusing on Fargo here just to kind of streamline everything. Back in the early part of the 20th century, late 19th century, there was actually a lot of days with heavy precipitation at Fargo. That kind of trailed off through the Dust Bowl era, the 40s, the 50s. Since then, we've seen a few years, 1998, 2007, 2019, where we've seen over 20 days with half an inch of moisture. But the overall trend there is not that impressive. So unlike other parts of the country, we haven't seen a dramatic increase in heavy precipitation days. I will be getting into the growing season soon, but I did want to show one more slide here that especially the soybean folks might find interesting. You know this, but it's kind of interesting to see it in graphical format. When I came into USDA in the late 90s, the state was just topping 1 million acres for harvested soybean acreage for the first time. Soybeans were basically an afterthought from the beginning of time through World War II, through the 60s, the 70s. Started to see an increase in acreage in the 80s. But who would have imagined if you were starting farming in the 50s or 60s that that's how many soybean acres would be harvested in North Dakota today? Part of that's technological improvements. Part of it is a warmer climate. There's a number of factors leading into that, but if you could have seen that coming, wow, that's quite an exponential increase in soybean acreage. Now we've seen over 7 million acres harvested a couple of times. Truly remarkable to see the adjustment to change that you folks are able to produce. All right, speaking of soybeans, I'm going to talk about the 2024 growing season. So I'm going to show a series of charts. Cropping areas are shown here. These are internal graphs that we use or charts that we use at USDA. Major areas, 75% of U.S. production are dark green. Minor areas, 24% of U.S. production, light green. So you add up the dark green, light green, that's 99% of your national production. And then the yellow numbers indicate from the 2022 census what percentage of that is contributing to the national production. So North Dakota coming in 5% of the U.S. soybean production, obviously most of the acreage in the valley or the southeast. Well, let me go back for just a second. Oh, went the wrong way, sorry. So for 2024, the U.S. yield hurt by late drought was up marginally, a fraction of a percent. North Dakota, compared to 2023, up almost 6%, despite the development of some dryness and drought late in the growing season. If you look at the state-by-state numbers, probably can't see the specific numbers from there, but if you see the shading in blue, that was an improvement from 2023. If you see the reds and pinks, that's a decline from 2023 yield. You can see North Dakota actually, obviously up 5.6%. Neighboring South Dakota down a little bit, a little worse as you move east. And then what really trimmed the yield was the drought in the eastern Corn Belt into parts of the Mid-South. Really untimely heat there, late summer drought. And that took the top off of what had been expected to be a pretty good national crop. If you look at sunflowers, and I was talking to some folks about that last night, huge cut in acreage for 2024. U.S. yield down 6.5%. North Dakota yield down more than 12%. Just not economically feasible, really, for sunflowers in 2024. Corn, U.S. yield was up 1.1% despite the trimming of the crop due to drought. North Dakota yield up 4.2%. And again, a lot of the central and western Corn Belt did pretty well. We saw record yields coming out of neighboring South Dakota. Iowa, 211 bushels per acre. Illinois, even better than that at 217. North Dakota, respectable 149, up 4% from last year. But again, drought really trimmed prospects in the eastern Corn Belt, the mid-Atlantic, and the southeast. Relatively minor production areas, sure, but overall, just up 1.1%, a record, but when you consider the trend, really kind of a disappointing year for corn overall. with that late drought impact. Looking at some other commodities, alfalfa hay, such an important part of North Dakota, number 3 state for alfalfa. U.S. yield was up almost 15%, North Dakota helping that along with a 12% increase, again, despite some of the drought issues, especially in the west and the south. Hay, not including alfalfa, U.S. yield up 10% from 2023, North Dakota yield up 11%. And then spring wheat, much better year than 2023. North Dakota up a whopping 21.6%. U.S. yield 14% up. And then winter wheat, not a whole lot of acreage here, but I'll mention it anyway. North Dakota yield was down 3.6%. U.S. yield up 2%. And then it's kind of interesting to look at the spring wheat numbers because you had the record in North Dakota coming in at 59 bushels per acre, but neighboring Montana did poorly there with a much lower yield compared to the previous year. So somewhere in there was a dividing line where things got markedly worse. A couple more crops to focus on for 24. Durum yield, good year for durum overall. U.S. yield up 6, North Dakota 27% up from 2023. Barley also did well both in the U.S. and North Dakota. Again, North Dakota absolutely essential to both of those crops as well as many others. Durum, once again, we saw that east-west divide with North Dakota with a record 47, up 27%, but neighboring Montana just 23 bushels per acre, down more than a quarter from 2023. Don't want to leave out the sugar beet folks and the vegetable growers. The sugar beets, U.S. yield was pretty flat, but North Dakota up 9%. A winter like this that we're having now, much better for storage than previously when I know the technology is improving on how to store the beets and climate control them, but when you have a mild winter like we had before, that's tough on the storage. And then finally, durum wheat yield. There's again the divide between North Dakota and Montana. Record yield from North Dakota, 47, just 23 from Montana. Sorry, I went the wrong way with that. And then finally, I'm going to talk about cattle just a little bit. Not a huge endeavor for the state when you compare it to the national numbers, whether you're looking at cattle, beef cows, or other animals. But we will be getting into lambing and calving season here soon, so I know that's on the forefront of some of the producers' minds. And I want to talk about how it relates to drought. As a drought monitor author since the late 90s for the 25 years of the product, obviously the drought situation near and dear to my heart. I'm one of the 8 authors drawing these lines for the drought monitor. For a lot of 2024, we had very little drought in the heart of the growing season. Look at June, look at July, just patches of dryness and some of the lower end drought categories. But as the year went on, we got into August and September, the drought really coming back, and that could be a factor for 2025 as we've reduced soil moisture heading into the cold season. The way the drought monitor works is that we base it on percentile rankings. So when you see a D4, all the indicators that we use, whether it's precipitation, soil moisture, stream flow, vegetation health, or whatever we're using, we look at that as a percentile ranking. So when you get to a D4, that's the type of drought you would expect to see every once to 50 to 100 years. We like to see a convergence of those indicators into that level. You don't always get that agreement. So when you get into the D3s and D4s, that's pretty significant drought. D4, 1 in 50 to 100 year drought. A D3, like we currently see in parts of western North Dakota, that's like a 1 in 20 to 1 in 50 year drought. So we pay careful attention to when we're drawing these drought lines that we try to match up with historical frequencies. So that is significant drought currently in western North Dakota. Also across the southern tier of the state, we've got some pretty dry soils there as well. No drought really confined to central and northeastern North Dakota at this time. We're getting pretty close to the start of the growing season. That is a consideration that we have very little soil moisture to fall back on the further west and south you go through the region. Currently, for the U.S. as a whole, 64% of the country is either dry or in drought, and almost 40% of the country is experiencing some degree of drought. Most of the drought now focused in the southwest through parts of southern Texas and West Texas. Another big area, northern Rockies through the northern plains, and then still some patches of drought in the east and the Great Lakes region. During the 2024 growing season, this was the trend from mid-May to late October. So remember, we had very little drought in North Dakota through June and July, and then the wheels fell off in terms of precipitation. So a lot of the northern plains turned markedly drier with 1 to 2 to 3 category reductions or deterioration in drought. That's also true for the southeastern plains, the mid-south, eastern Corn Belt. And so all those areas much drier by the time we got to late October. And that's where we went into the winter, the cold season, with limited soil moisture heading into 2025. It does not help that we've had a snow drought in much of the upper Midwest and northern plains. There has been more snow this winter in New Orleans, Pensacola, and Beaumont, Port Arthur, Texas, than there has been in Lincoln, Nebraska, and Omaha, Nebraska. 1 inch of snow so far this entire winter in eastern Nebraska, less than 5 inches so far in Des Moines, Iowa, and even here we're running less than half of normal for snowfall accumulations. So that doesn't help. We went into fall, winter with dry soils. We haven't had much snow, so we need spring moisture to bring things back up to a more normal level before we get into the growing season. In the last 10 weeks, early November to mid-January, we have seen some improvement in a lot of areas. It's a good time of year to replenish soil moisture if you can get the storminess. Problem here is a lot of the snow that has fallen has been powdery, it's blowing around, it's not much, and so there's not much moisture content. So we've really not improved the situation much over the last 2 to 3 months here. Areas like in the eastern Corn Belt have seen improvement. Southeastern plains, mid-south, all doing better. The northwest is doing better. The southwest is not. Looking at the history of drought in North Dakota, just based on the U.S. Drought Monitor, I've kind of highlighted some of the big droughts over the years. There was a period of extended drought in the early 21st century, but a lot of the drought categories were relatively low. We did have significant drought 2006 through 2008 with some breaks in that drought coverage. 2012 wasn't horrible here compared to other parts of the country. That was a continental scale drought, and it did reach into this area, and it was hot. But the overall drought coverage was not as significant as the previous drought a few years earlier. 2017 certainly shows up. 2021 really shows up. And we've never really completely vanquished the drought that came on a few years ago. We've had some better periods embedded in that, but it seems like we've been kind of chronically dry since 2021 if you look at the Drought Monitor. One thing the U.S. Drought Monitor is tied to that I have nothing to do with other than the fact that I draw the drought lines is livestock forage disaster program. So I told you I'd come back to the livestock angle. And since it was enshrined in the Farm Bill in 2008, LFP payouts nationally over that 15, 16-year period have totaled $13 billion. So we recognize the importance of the Drought Monitor for the farming community, especially the livestock producers. Those numbers, of course, don't include other programs that have been tied to the Drought Monitor depiction, such as the pandemic-era emergency relief program, that doled out money to the row crop producers here. So overall, the big years for LFP payouts topping $1.5 billion in 2013, 2022, and 2023. And so it kind of follows the drought coverage, very much so. And again, $13 billion in that program history. I'm hearing that there may be some modifications to the LFP formula in the new Farm Bill that might smooth out that little awkward step between 8 weeks at D2, 1 monthly payment, and then any time at D3, 3 monthly payments. That's been a kind of a consternation for the Drought Monitor folks because Everybody wants to make that jump from 1 to 3. So I think they may smooth that formula out. Stay tuned to the next Farm Bill for that. Here's how that money, that $13 billion has been broken up. North Dakota, the recipient of $223 million for the livestock producers over the last 15, 16 years. The big numbers come in from further south. Look at Texas, Oklahoma, both over $2 billion. Kansas, over $1 billion. North Dakota payments, again, as I mentioned, 2012, not too significant on the high-end drought levels. Only about $13 million going to the state from that drought. That did not match up to 2008 and certainly didn't compare to 17 or 21. All right, here we go. We're going to break into the forecast in the last couple of minutes here. We finally have gotten into a La Nina situation. We were in a La Nina watch for almost a year. I think the first watch came out February of 2024. We kept waiting. Finally, December of 2024, we're into La Nina. So we're focusing on this one little area of the equatorial Pacific. When that water gets cold enough, it starts affecting wind patterns, atmospheric patterns across the globe, including North America. So here's a recent sea surface temperature anomaly showing that La Nina zone where that cool water is affecting atmospheric patterns downstream. The forecast is for a weak and short-lived La Nina, but it is influencing North American weather patterns. The cold waves of December, January, and now into February certainly are related to the jet stream disruptions from La Nina, as well as the southwestern drought, Southern California fires, and some of the stormy weather we're starting to see across the Ohio Valley into the eastern Corn Belt. We expect to be neutral again by later in the spring into the summer, so neutral conditions expected to return for the growing season. The seasonal drought outlook through the end of April indicating, unfortunately for this area in the north central U.S., that if you're in drought now, it is expected to be still there at the end of April. If you go to the west, into the northern Rockies, if you go east into the Great Lakes region, likely to see some improvement in the drought situation there. Another area expecting ongoing or developing drought would be the southern tier of the country, Southern California through the Gulf Coast. So looking ahead to the rest of winter and spring, well, the atmospheric block that brought our dry late summer and fall has, well, I'll say shifted more than broken down. It's kind of shifted away. So we are expecting La Nina to contribute to an active winter storm track, not unlike what we're going to see later this week, where we get storms moving through the Ohio Valley and on into the northeast. Expect ongoing drought in the southwest. Continued episodic cold outbreaks, especially northern plains into the eastern U.S., not unlike what we have outside today. Here is the National Weather Service outlook for February, March, April. You can see the impact of the episodic cold outbreaks, northern plains and northwest. These are in probabilities. Just because you see blue or red on the map for the temperature doesn't mean 100% likelihood of cold or warm. The odds are tilted in that direction. So do expect a likelihood of below normal temperatures for the Dakotas and points west, not unlike what we have seen over the last several weeks. For precipitation, 2 bullseyes of wetness, but unfortunately not in the Dakotas. We see that storm track expected to be active from, say, the northern Mississippi Delta on through the eastern Corn Belt, interior northeast, another pocket in the northwest. So that's kind of the outlook for the rest of winter into spring. Don't think we're going to see any meaningful drought relief through at least April of 2025. That brings us to the beginning of the growing season. How are we looking? Well, I guess that's good for field work, maybe not good for having a good year unless we get a wet summer, right? So La Nina fading away, that's probably good news. Neutral conditions, as I mentioned. Climate models are showing a northwesterly dip in the jet stream through the north central United States, late spring into summer. I'll show what that means in a minute. But there may be a ridge building in the west that could try to shift eastward. A lot of the climate models, and they look at more than 24 of them, are suggesting this western ridge trying to build eastward. how that plays out in these probability forecasts. Look for conditions that are not particularly hot in the upper Midwest. Equal chances, meaning above, below, or near normal temperatures are equally likely, but you see some heat starting to possibly build further west. Look at the precipitation pattern. This is May, June, July. I'm a little concerned about the ridge in the west if it tries to work its way eastward. Kind of divides North Dakota right up and down there, so you get to western North Dakota, odds start to tilt towards drier than normal conditions. That happens to be where we have some D2 and D3 right now. So I am concerned about moisture, western North Dakota and points west. Hopefully further east, it'll be more normal conditions. Temperatures may not be a problem, at least early in the growing season. As we move one more season here, I'll look at the late summer into the end of the growing season, beginning of the harvest season. Enso neutral, so not much skill in precipitation forecasting, but still I think we'll see enhanced odds of drier than normal condition parts of the northern plains. Potentially that trough, that northwesterly flow may deepen as we get into late summer. So again, heat may not be a concern, especially further east you go. How that translates into the forecast, August, September, October, a lot of the heat seems to be pushed down to the east, the south, or even the west. So again, hopefully not a hot summer upcoming if we can just get some moisture. So that's going to be the real wild card. How much moisture can we get to overcome the antecedent drought and the lack of snowfall this winter? So yeah, a little concern for drought, more so as you drive west from here. And that's how it's looking for our forecast for the spring, rest of the winter, spring, and summer. And I'll leave you with this last slide. Typical impacts from La Nina. This doesn't mean 100% chance. Even in our highest La Nina probabilities, you get about a 70 to 80% likelihood of these actual anomalies happening. We're checking off some of the boxes. Southwestern drought in the United States, for example. Some of the problems that they're having right now in Brazil as they move into their second crop or winter crop corn, which is the majority corn crop, some real drought issues in southern Brazil and northeastern Argentina. So that's kind of checking off the box there for La Nina. Those are some important ones for American agriculture, obviously, when you start talking about the weather in Brazil and Argentina. So we'll continue to monitor that as we move through. They're on obviously the opposite calendar. We're February, they're in late August, so they're getting into their winter season, or their late summer season at this point. So anyway, I will leave you with that, and hopefully we have time for some questions from Clinton's magic machine here.
Let's give him a round of applause. All right, we got some great questions here. A couple I want to start with. So this is a question. I don't know this, but I'm not a meteorologist, haven't done this. Just play one on TV. The validity of the Gleisberg cycle, which is an 89-year drought cycle, 1847, 1936, is 2025 the next year. As you look at these cycles, can we start to make sense of them?
Yeah, so I'm not a climate scientist. There is so much I do not understand. I pretend I know about weather and a little bit about climate, but everything from solar cycles to solar radiation, it's very complex and confusing. That's why I don't try to predict where this warming trend is going to go down the road, because we just don't know a whole lot. I've heard of the cycle, and I don't think it's really fair to like just say 89 years, that's automatic drought. There's so many other things going on right now. We have a situation right now where the oceans are very, very warm. That is obviously contributing to our above normal global temperatures right now. And it really makes it, one thing we have seen a lot of in recent years is blocking patterns in the spring and fall. And that's where you get stuck in a pattern where it gets too wet or too cold, too warm, too hot, and too dry. And it stays for a month or two. And I don't think that type of thing is, you can't even predict more than a few months ahead with that kind of stuff. So I really hesitate to talk about 89-year cycles, right, especially given the changes that we've undergone in our lifetimes with warming and wetter climate than we had 50 years ago.
As you talk about this and some of the shifts that we've seen, do you think we'll see significant shifts in U.S. weather patterns in the next 15 years? Are there indicators that we may see some shifts?
Yeah, I think the thing I would point out is that we do see more, I feel like, extreme weather events. Some of that may be due to the blocking that I just referenced, where we do get stuck in patterns, especially in the swing seasons, the spring and the fall. And so that leads to more extreme, some of these heavier rainfall or snowfall events. The spring flooding can be a factor with that. So yeah, I think it's going to be a wild ride in politics and weather over the next couple of decades. That's my prediction.
All right, last question here. You showed us at the beginning, with the climate slowly warming just a little bit here, does that seem like a cyclical trend, or is it something else? Or are we learning as we go here?
Yeah, I hate to make a prediction because we had that net cooling from the 30s through the 70s. We've seen a 50-year warming trend since then. But the way we've warmed is weird, and I showed that in the beginning, where it's like it's off season, so we get the winter, and it's nighttime. So it's like a weird thing like that. I really hesitate to go forward from here and try to hazard a guess. The Earth climate system is obviously smarter than I am, and I can take it. I don't want to Monday morning quarterback it too much until we're out in the future and look back. I just don't know where we're going with this.
Absolutely. Let's give Brad a round of applause. Thank you, Brad. Thank you so much.
Appreciate it.
All right, we've made it to our first break. I'm proud of you. Everybody stuck with us here. Don't forget, if you go around and you visit with the folks at the booths, take your passport with you. Prizes will be given out at the end of today. You must be present to win. Remember that. Go to the registration table if you haven't already picked up a passport. If you fill it out, which I expect everybody to do here in the next 30 minutes, drop off at booth 57 when it is completed, and we will get you registered. It's got to be dropped off if you want to win, though. So that's important. Before you stand up, please pick up a little bit while you're here. Take some trash if you don't mind. We'll be resetting and getting ready for our next great conversation here. We'll be right back here at 11:25 for how sustainable aviation fuel development can boost crop demand with a representative from Delta Airlines. So thank you so much for our first session. Come back in just a few minutes. Take a break. Enjoy.